Andra, as we consider this affordability message, and I would note that there is a great piece on the idea of affordability and the squeeze Americans are feeling. It's our big take piece today that can be found on the Terminal or on Bloomberg.com. But it notes how since the pandemic, what used to cost $100 now costs the American family $126. It goes bit by bit to things like groceries, with flour up 40% since 2020, seafood up 23%, medical costs pretty remarkable as well. Nursing homes up 29%, for example. Now, a lot of this did happen when Donald Trump was not president, and yet he is president now, and it's his burden to bear. What will it take for him to be successful in turning that narrative around and convincing people in Georgia and elsewhere that actually he's doing good things for them on the question of affordability?
Well, thanks for having me. President Trump has a big task ahead of him, and I think he's figuring out that just as it was hard for President Biden to convince the American public that he had a handle on the affordability situation, President Trump is also having a trouble claiming the narrative, and he's trying to retake the narrative with this national tour and this stop in Georgia. I think he's trying to stop Democrats who have used affordability as a way to triangulate Trump policy and to point out that President Trump has not kept his campaign promises with respect to that. So I think he's trying to pivot and reclaim the narrative and use terminology that will help voters see that he is doing what he can. The problem with this is that there are the economic numbers that he can look at. He can look at how inflation was lower than expected last month, but there's also the way people perceive and how people feel about these particular issues. And so the mood isn't good. And if we look at President Trump's national numbers in terms of job approval on issues related to the economy and inflation, he is typically in most national polls underwater and underwater by a substantial amount in a lot of these polls. So he really is behind the eight ball a little bit. And I think he's trying to figure out what message will actually resonate and pierce through the malaise that a lot of people feel, because they expected, given the promises on the 2024 campaign trail, that this was going to be his top priority and that he was going to address it quickly. And that hasn't materialized.
Well, Professor, we were struck as Kaylee and I were thinking back at the last time we had a chance to compare notes with you, and even further, let's say 2 years ago, the conversations that we were having about this very same issue when the president's last name was Biden. What does this President Trump have to learn from his predecessor when it comes to prices?
I think that there are a lot of things that you have to learn. One, talk is big. There comes a point at which you have to deliver, and he might be in the period right now where it's becoming less plausible for President Trump to blame everything on the mistakes of the Biden administration, right? So now that we're more than a year into his administration, this is his economy, and he's going to have to own it and take responsibility for it. Second, I mean, the thing that is unique for Biden and Trump is the fact that President Trump has, initiated tariffs from countries around the world. And so it's a question of to what extent have those tariffs not actually helped dampen prices, right? I mean, he's possibly thinking long term about promoting manufacturing in the United States. But I think that there was and has always been a larger structural question about whether or not that's in the long term a feasible plan in order to make sure that we can keep prices down in the United States. But I think just in general, right, it points to the role that governments can actually play in helping to manage the economy, and then what things are outside of their control. Like, what is the market kind of doing on its own that government intervention is not going to be able to help? And I think it's a question of whether or not government intervention can actually end up exacerbating some of these market phenomena that we're witnessing.
So, Andra, when we consider what this means electorally, knowing President Trump, unlike Joe Biden, is not up for re-election himself, but is concerned with what happens in terms of the outcome of the midterms and whether or not the Republican Party can retain control of both chambers of Congress, what is the impact on affordability likely to be on voter behavior in the midterm elections? If you're dissatisfied with the economy, are you more likely to turn out to vote against the party in power? Or are you just less likely to participate at all, knowing it isn't a presidential election year? I just wonder how we should think about the force of this, whether it's driving people to the polls or just encouraging people to maybe not participate at all.
Yeah, so the way that political scientists would factor this into modeling is actually a little bit more indirect, even though there are ways that we can make direct correlations between perceptions of the economy and vote choice. But in a lot of the models that would predict vote choice, perceptions of the economy would funnel into overall perceptions of job approval. And it's those job approval ratings that are then combined with other data like voter preferences in the generic ballot to try to predict how many seats we expect Democrats and Republicans to win in both the House and the Senate. So this is going to be an important factor that many voters consider. And for people who voted for Donald Trump because they perceived him to be better adept at handling the economy than Kamala Harris, I think the fear or the concern is, does President Trump have enough time to turn the economy around and change perceptions, or are those people going to defect? Are they going to defect to the Republican Party, or are they going to not vote in this election? Either way, that's going to have an impact on the results of this midterm election cycle.
Andra Gillespie, we've got about a minute left. I want to ask you what the conversation is on the ground in Georgia following the seizing of ballots and other materials from Fulton County, which happened at the end of January now, January 28th, when the FBI rolled into town. Tulsi Gabbard photographed. Is Georgia going to be the center of questions about election integrity once again in this election?
President Trump seems to want to make it that way. The thing about Georgia that's really interesting is that while this is still a Republican state, there are many different types of Republicans in the state, and they hold power and compete against each other. So there are some Republicans who welcomed this raid, and then there are others who dreaded it because it was just resurfacing old issues that they were hoping were buried. And then there is the response of Democrats. So Democrats have been alarmed by what they have seen. They are concerned about voter integrity. They are concerned about the veracity of the case that's being presented and the grounds on which there was a warrant for this particular case. And then there were larger concerns about whether or not this could be used as a tool of voter suppression. This could be the potential to, has the potential to galvanize voters against President Trump and the Republican Party. And so this is something that people from the more establishment wing of the Republican Party would have probably preferred not happen.